Hello. Happy Halloween. Here we are. I'm on Skye right now in the northwest of Scotland, and the wind is howling and whistling and occasionally screaming, and the rain is pattering, and there's logs burning in the fireplace, and I'm here to read to you because it's Halloween, and because sometimes it's so much easier to be scared of little things that we can leave when they're over than to be scared of the world outside, which we cannot leave. Or at least not leave and come back. So, wonderful wedding hat. Doesn't get worn a lot. And the first thing I want to read you, it is, as a lot of my short stories are right now, in this hefty great tome with my head exploding on the cover in the UK edition, called The Neil Gaiman Reader. And this is a story called Click, Clack, the Rattlebag. Before you take me up to bed, will you tell me a story? Do you actually need me to take you up to bed? I asked the boy. He thought for a moment, then, with intense seriousness, yes, actually, I think I do. It's because I've finished my homework, and so it's my bedtime, and I am a bit scared. Not very scared, just a bit. But it is a very big house, and lots of times the lights don't work, and it's sort of dark. I reached over and tousled his hair. I can understand that, I said. It is a very big old house. He nodded. We were in the kitchen, where it was light and warm. I put down my magazine on the kitchen table. What kind of story would you like me to tell you? Well, he said thoughtfully, I don't think it should be too scary, because then when I go up to bed, I would just be thinking about monsters the whole time. But if it isn't just a little bit scary, then I won't be interested. And you make up scary stories, don't you? I know she says that's what you do. Well, she exaggerates. I write stories, yes. Nothing that's really been published yet, though. And I write lots of different kinds of stories. But you do write scary stories. Yes. The boy looked up at me from the shadows by the door where he was waiting. Do you know any stories about Click Clack the Rattlebag? I don't think so. Those are the best sorts of stories. Do they tell them at your school? He shrugged. Sometimes. What's a Click Clack the Rattlebag story? He was a precocious child and was unimpressed by his sister's boyfriend's ignorance. You could see it on his face. Everybody knows them. I don't, I said, trying not to smile. He looked at me as if he was trying to decide whether or not I was pulling his leg. He said, I think maybe you should take me up to my bedroom, and then you can tell me a story before I go to sleep. But probably it should be a not scary story, because I'll be up in my bedroom then, and it's actually a bit dark up there too. I said, shall I leave a note for your sister, telling her where we are? You can, but you'll hear when they get back. The front door is very slammy. We walked out of the warm and cozy kitchen into the hallway of the big house, where it was chilly and drafty and dark. I flicked the light switch, but the hall remained dark. "The bulb's gone," the boy said. "That always happens." Our eyes adjusted to the shadows. The moon was almost full, and blue-white moonlight shone in through the high windows on the staircase, down into the hall. "We'll be all right," I said. "Yes," said the boy, soberly. "I am very glad you're here." He seemed less precocious now. His hand found mine, and he held onto my fingers comfortably, trustingly, as if he'd known me all his life. I felt responsible and adult. I did not know if the feeling I had for his sister, who was my girlfriend, was love. Not yet. But I liked that the child treated me as one of the family. I felt like his big brother. And I stood taller. And if there was something unsettling about the empty house, I would not have admitted it for worlds. The stairs creaked beneath the threadbare stair carpet. "Click-clacks," said the boy, "are the best monsters ever." "Are they from television?" "I don't think so. I don't think any people know where they come from. Mostly they come from the dark." "Good place for a monster to come." "Yes." We walked along the upper corridor in the shadows, moving from patch of moonlight to patch of moonlight. It really was a big house. I wished I had a flashlight. "They come from the dark," said the boy, holding on to my hand. "I think probably they're made of dark. And they come in when you don't pay attention. That's when they come in. And then they take you back to their, not nests. What's a word that's like nests, but not? House? No, it's not a house. Lair?" He was silent. Then, "I think that's the word, yes. Lair." He squeezed my hand. He stopped talking. "Right, so they take the people who don't pay attention back to their lair. And what do they do then, your monsters? Do they suck all the blood out of you, like vampires?" He snorted. "Vampires don't suck all the blood out of you. They only drink a little bit, just to keep them going and, flying around. Click-clacks are much scarier than vampires." "I'm not scared of vampires," I told him. "Me neither. I'm not scared of vampires either. Do you want to know what click-clacks do? They drink you," said the boy. "Like a Coke?" "Coke is very bad for you," said the boy. "If you put a tooth in Coke, in the morning it will be dissolved into nothing. That's how bad Coke is for you and why you must always clean your teeth every night." I'd heard the Coke story as a boy and had been told as an adult that it wasn't true, but was certain that a lie which promoted dental hygiene was a good lie, and I let it pass. "Click-clacks drink you," said the boy. "First they bite you, and then you go all icky inside, and all your meat and all your brains and everything except your bones and your skin turns into a wet, milkshakey stuff, and then the click-clack sucks it out through the holes where your eyes used to be." "That's disgusting," I told him. "Did you make it up?" We'd reached the last flight of stairs, all the way into the big house. "No? I can't believe you kids make up stuff like that." "You didn't ask me about the rattle bag," he said. "Right. What's the rattle bag?" "Well," he said, sagely, soberly, a small voice from the darkness beside me, "once you're just bones and skin, they hang you up on a hook, and you rattle in the wind." So what do these click-clacks look like? Even as I asked him, I wished I could take the question back and leave it unasked. I thought, huge, spidery creatures, like the one in the shower this morning. I'm afraid of spiders. I was relieved when the boy said, they looked like what you aren't expecting, what you aren't paying attention to. We were climbing wooden steps now. I held on to the railing on my left, held his hand with my right as he walked beside me. It smelled like dust and old wood, that high in the house. The boy's tread was certain, though, even though the moonlight was scarce. Do you know what story you're going to tell me to put me to bed? He asked. Like I said, it doesn't actually have to be scary. No, not really. Maybe you could tell me about this evening. Tell me what you did. Oh, that won't make much of a story for you. My girlfriend just moved into a new place on the edge of town. She inherited it from an aunt or someone. It's very big and very old. I'm going to spend my first night with her tonight, so I've been waiting for an hour or so for her and her housemates to come back with the wine and an Indian takeaway. See, said the boy. There was that precocious amusement again, but all kids can be insufferable sometimes when they think they know something you don't. It's probably good for them. You know all that, but you don't think. You just let your brain fill in the gaps. He pushed open the door to the attic room. It was perfectly dark now, but the opening door disturbed the air, and I heard things rattle gently, like dry bones in thin bags in the slight wind. Click, clack, click, clack. Like that. I would have pulled away then, if I could, but small, firm fingers pulled me forward, unrelentingly, into the dark. So, that was Click Clack the Rattle Bag. And that's the first of the things I want to read tonight. And the second isn't by me at all. And this was actually, in a lot of ways, why I thought it would be fun to do a reading. It's by a girl, and it seemed just a little bit too appropriate for the world we're in right now. It's called The Mask of the Red Death. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal, the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores with dissolution. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the pest ban which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall girdled it in. This wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers and welded the bolts. prince. They resolved to leave means neither of ingress nor egress to the sudden impulses of despair or of frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatori, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All these and security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was towards the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade. But first, let me tell of the rooms in which it was held. These were 7, an imperial suite. In many palaces, however, such suites form a long and straight vista, while the folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either hand, so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here the case was very different, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bizarre. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced but little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon a closed corridor which pursued the windings of the suite. These windows were of stained glass, whose colour varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth was furnished and lighted with orange, the fifth with white, the sixth with violet. The 7th apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon a carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only, the colour of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood colour. Now, in no one of the 7 apartments was there any lamp or candelabrum amid the profusion of golden ornaments that lay scattered to and fro or depended from the roof. There was no light of any kind emanating from lamp or candle within the suite of chambers, but in the corridors that followed the suite there stood, opposite to each window, a heavy tripod bearing a brazier of fire that projected its rays through the tinted glass and so glaringly illumined the room. And thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western or black chamber, the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within its precincts at all. It was in this apartment, also, that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang. And when the minute hand made the circuit of the face, and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that at each lapse of an hour the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance to hearken to the sound. And thus the waltzers perforce ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company, and while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and sedate passed their hands over their brows as if in confused reverie or meditation. And when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled as if at their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows each to the other that the next chiming of the clock should produce in them no similar emotion. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embrace 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, there came yet another chiming of the clock, and then, with the same disconcert and tremulousness and meditation as before. But in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colours and effects. He disregarded the decora of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric lustre. There are some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. He had directed, in great part, the movable embellishments of the 7 chambers upon occasion of this grand fête, and it was his own guiding taste which had given character to the masqueraders. Be sure, they were grotesque. There were much glare and glitter and piquancy and phantasm, much of what has been since seen in Hernani. There were arabesque figures with unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies, such as the madman fashions. There were much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust. To and fro in the 7 chambers there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams. And these, the dreams, writhed in and about, taking hue from the rooms and caused the wild music of the orchestra to seem as the echo of their steps. And anon, there strikes the ebony clock, which stands in the hall of the velvet. And then for a moment all is still and all is silent, save the voice of the clock. The dreams are stiff frozen as they stand, but the echoes of the chime die away. They have endured but an instant, and a light, half-subdued laughter floats after them as they depart, and now again the music swells and the dreams live, and writhe to and fro more merrily than ever, taking hue from the mented windows through which stream the rays from the tripods. But to the chamber, which lies most westwardly of the 7, there are now none of the maskers who venture, for the night is waning away, and there flows a ruddier light through the blood-coloured panes, and the blackness of the sable drapery appalls. And to him whose foot falls upon the sable carpet, there comes from the near clock of ebony a muffled peal more solemnly emphatic than any which reaches their ears who indulged in the more remote gaieties of the other apartments. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life, and the revel went whirlingly on until at length there commenced the sounding of midnight upon the clock. And then the music ceased, as I have told, and the evolutions of the waltzes were quieted. And there was an uneasy cessation of all things as before, but now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock, and thus it happened, perhaps, that more of thought crept with more of time into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who revelled. And thus, too, it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, There were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure, which had arrested the attention of no single individual before. And the rumour of this new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz, or murmur, expressive of disapprobation and surprise, and then finally of terror, of horror, and of disgust. In an assembly of phantasms such as I have painted, it may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such sensation. In truth, the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited, but the figure in question had out-Heroded Herod and gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's indefinite decorum. There are chords in the hearts of the most reckless, which cannot be touched without emotion, even with the utterly lost, to whom life and death are equally jests. There are matters of which no jest can be made. The whole company, indeed, seemed now deeply to feel that in the costume and bearing of the stranger neither wit nor piety existed. The figure was tall and gaunt and shrouded from head to in the habiliments of the grave. The mask, which concealed the visage, was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse that the closest scrutiny must have had difficulty in detecting the cheat. And yet all this might have been endured, if not approved, by the mad revellers around, but the mummer had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His vesture was dabbled in blood, and his broad brow, with all the features of the face, was besprinkled with the scarlet horror. When the eyes of the Prince Prospero fell upon this spectral image, which, with a slow and solemn movement, as if more fully to sustain its role, stalked to and fro among the waltzers, he was seen to be convulsed in the first moment with a strong shudder, either of terror or distaste, but in the next his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares?" he demanded hoarsely of the courtiers who stood near him. "Who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements." It was in the eastern or blue chamber in which stood the Prince Prospero as he uttered these words. They rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was a bold and robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room where stood the prince, with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of this group in the direction of the intruder, who at the moment was also near at hand, and now, with a deliberate and stately step, made closer approach to the speaker. But from a certain nameless awe with which the mad assumptions of the mummer had inspired the whole party, there were found none who put forth hand to seize him, so that unimpeded he passed within a yard of the prince's person. And while the vast assembly, as if with one impulse, shrank from the centres of the room to the walls, he made his way, uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn and measured step which had distinguished him from the first, through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and even thence to the violet, ere a decided movement had been made to arrest him. It was then, however, that the Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and the shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him, on account of a deadly terror that had seized upon all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger, and had approached in rapid impetuosity to within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which instantly afterwards fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of the revellers at once threw themselves into the black apartment, and seizing the mummer, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony clock, gasped in unutterable horror at finding the grave cerements and corpse-like mask, which they handled with so violent a rudeness, untenanted by any tangible form. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revellers in the blood-bedewed halls of their revel, and died each in the despairing posture of his fall. And the life of the ebony clock went out with that of the last of the gay, and the flames of the tripods expired, and darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. There. That was Edgar Allan Poe's story. And I thought I'd end with something more homely, more cheerful, more personal, especially in this storm. This began with me wondering what the scariest place in the world is. I was born in Portsmouth and grew up there as a small child. My grandparents in Southsea, and I'd go down to the beach. And it always seemed to me that the beaches of English seaside towns out of season are the scariest places of all. But then again, there are places that are scarier. This is called My Last Landlady. My last landlady, she was nothing like you. Her rooms were damp. The breakfasts were unpleasant. Oily eggs, leathery sausages, a baked orange sludge of beans. Her face could have curdled beans. She was not kind. You strike me as a kind person. I hope your world is kind. By which I mean, I've heard we see the world not as it is, but as we are. A saint sees a world of saints. A killer sees only murderers and victims. I see the dead. My landlady told me she would not willingly walk upon the beach, for it was littered with weapons, huge hand-fitting rocks, each ripe for striking. She only had a little money in her tiny purse, she said, but they would take the notes, oily from her fingers, and leave the purse tucked underneath a stone. And the water, she said, hold anyone under. Chill salt water, grey and brown, heavy as sin, all ready to drag you away. Children went like that so easily in the sea, when they were surplus to requirements, or had learned awkward facts they might be inclined to pass on to those who would listen. There were people on the West Pier the night it burned, she said. The curtains were dusty lace and blocked each town-grimed window. Sea view. That was a laugh. The morning she saw me twitch her curtains to see if it was properly raining, she rapped my knuckles. "Mr. Moroney," she said, "in this house we do not look at the sea through the windows. It brings bad luck." She said, "People come to the beach to forget their problems. It's what we do. It's what the English do. You chop your girlfriend up because she's pregnant and you're worried what the wife would say if she found out, or you poison the banker you're sleeping with for the insurance, marry a dozen men in a dozen little seaside towns, Margate, Torquay, Lord love them, but why must they stand so still?" When I asked her who stood so still, she told me it was none of my beeswax and to be sure to be out of the house between midday and 4 as the Char was coming and I would be underfoot and in the way. I had been there 3 weeks. I was looking for permanent digs. The other guests were loveless folk on holiday and did not care if this was Hove or hell. We'd eat our dreary eggs together in the morning. I'd see them promenade if the day was fine or huddle under awnings if it rained. My landlady cared only that they were out of the house until tea time. A retired dentist from Edgbaston, down for a week of loneliness and drizzle by the sea, would nod at me over breakfast or if we passed on the seafront. The bathroom was down the hall. I was up in the night. I saw him in his dressing gown. I saw him knock upon her door. I saw it open. He went in. There's nothing more to tell. My last landlady was there at breakfast, bright and cheery. She said the dentist had left early due to a death in the family. She told the truth. That night the rain rattled my windows. A week passed, and it was time. I told my landlady I'd found a place and would be moving on and paid the rent. That night she gave me a glass of whiskey and then another and said I had always been her favourite and that she was a woman of needs, a flower ripe for plucking. And she smiled. And it was the whiskey made me nod and think she was perhaps a whit less sour of face and form. And so I knocked upon her door that night. She opened it. I remember the whiteness of her skin, the whiteness of her gown. I can't forget. "Mr. Moroney," she whispered. I reached for her, and that was forever that. The channel was cold and salt wet, and she filled my pockets with rocks to keep me under. So when they find me, if they find me, I could be anyone. Crab-eaten flesh and sea-washed bones and all. I think I shall like it here in my new digs, and you have made me welcome. You have all made me feel so welcome. How many of us are there here? I see us, but I cannot count. We cluster on the beach and stare at the light in the uppermost room of her house. We see the curtains twitch. We see a white face glaring through the grime. She looks afraid, as if one grey day we might start up the beach towards her to rebuke her for her lack of hospitality, to tear her for her bad breakfasts and her sour holidays. We stand so still. Why must we stand so still? There. That's my last landlady. And it's the last thing I'm going to do in the reading. Thank you for spending this 40 minutes with me as the wind howled and the rain lashed. I hope your Halloweens are marvelous things and that all the ghosts that come to visit you tonight are kind. Be good to each other. Good night.